Do I need the mic in order for the video to pick it up? Okay, yeah, well, I'll do my best here. All right, well, thanks, Steve. So I'm Tim. A bit about me before I get started. I'm a co-founder at a school called Rhythm. We're a boot camp in San Francisco, and part of my curriculum is React and React Native. So hopefully I'm decent at explaining this. We'll see how this goes. A bit more background, computer science. I hate talking about all this stuff. I worked at Amazon, I worked other places, and now I'm at Rhythm. And if you want to get in touch with me, I highly encourage it. I love hearing from people, so if you've got questions, if you want to, just say good job or bad job or whatever, get in touch with me there. It's Tim at Rhythm School. That's Rhythm School with an I. And my Twitter is Tim Garcia 0, because Tim Garcia was already taken. So I'm the first, starts with 0. All right, so first of all, what is React? Can I just see a show of hands? How many people have used React before? All right, this is a pretty React-heavy crowd. How many people have not used React and they're looking for more of an intro of it? Okay, cool. Cool, about 50-50 then. All right, well, yeah, I'm gonna go into kind of the conceptual underpinnings of React, the things you need to know in order to understand how to use the framework, and then show a quick code example that kind of like solidifies the concepts I'm trying to get across, hopefully. Wow. So this is probably way too hard to read over there. Let me see if I can make this a little better. There we go. Okay, so this is an example of using React in the browser. So if you haven't used React before, you might have heard a lot of buzzwords about Webpack, about JSX, about all these different tools that you need to get going with React. The purpose of this example is just to show that you can use React without all those things. It's not very common, and I wouldn't recommend it for production, but just as an example of like what React is. So in this example, we include 2 scripts, React.js and React DOM. Those are the 2 scripts that we need here. And then we use the React DOM to create some elements and ultimately append those to the DOM. So that div element and that h1 get combined in order to create an h1 inside of a div. The one key thing here is that the first property for these functions are whatever attributes we want on the element. So here this div has no attributes, and here this h1 tag has an attribute of ID with page title. And the second parameter to that function is what you want inside of the HTML. So it's like the inner HTML of that element. So inside of this div, we've got an h1. Inside of this h1, we've got some text that says hello world. Okay. So we combine all that, and then we call this method React DOM render, which actually renders that thing that we just created and puts it at some ID in the DOM. So this is just standard JavaScript. We're just saying, find some element by ID on the page, and then put this thing I just created at that ID. All right. So, oops. Yes. So that's all well and good. But like I was saying before, most people don't actually write React code that way. There's a lot of tools that help us out. So one of those tools is JSX. And if you haven't seen JSX before, it's going to seem pretty odd to you. The idea is essentially, rather than writing a bunch of HTML and then using JavaScript to like copy those templates somewhere, you're actually just writing the HTML inside of your JavaScript code. So in this example, we are creating essentially the same thing we created before, except we're just writing these tags as is, right? We're not using those functions to create those tags. So this here is JSX. And if you're an astute React developer here, you might notice that this code doesn't actually work because so far all we've got is React and React DOM. This won't actually work correctly because JavaScript doesn't know how to handle this yet. I'll get to kind of how we handle that in a minute. But conceptually what we're doing is we're creating the same component using JSX just by writing essentially HTML in our JavaScript, and then doing the same thing, we're rendering that code given that ID. So Another buzzword or maybe just concept you've heard a bunch when you think about React is a component. So the idea behind components is sort of an idea that's not unique to React, right? But it's something that React kind of championed. So there was a component spec in the browser that was native to the browser. As far as I know, it's kind of dying. But React has kind of taken this component idea up. And essentially the idea is that rather than writing a bunch of JavaScript that may or may not be separate, right? You could have like concerns overlapping in different functions and some parts of your code interacting with other parts of your code in maybe not so clear ways. The idea behind a component-based architecture is that you have one component for, say, displaying your sidebar, and another component for your nav, and another component for something else on your page. And that component should be pretty independent and reusable. If you're coming from maybe just like a OOP background or something else, the concepts are a little different, but in some ways it's the same, right? You want your code to be kind of do one thing and do it well. And that's essentially the idea behind components, is to have your component do one thing well and only do that thing. So the notes up here are essentially that components can be responsible for UI on the page, or a component could be responsible for a higher order function. So rather than create the UI itself, it might create UI components that it uses. Excuse me. So here's an example of that same thing that we did before, but as a component. I also need to add one more disclaimer to this slide. So create class is going away in the new version of React. This is deprecated right now. But I think it's useful to take a look at what this does to kind of understand it before we dive into all the features that React has. So when you are creating a component, all you really need, the one thing that you absolutely need to have is this render. And render just says, this is what I want to put in the DOM, right? So in our examples before, we created some variable that equals some JSX. Here we're just calling create class, giving it a render method, and returning this JSX. Right? One thing that I kind of slipped in there real quickly is a function, ES 2015 function. So how many people are familiar with that syntax? Okay. Seems to be very dominant this half of the room. It's very, very weird. But yeah, so this is essentially equivalent to just saying function, curly brace, and then returning this, right? So if you're not familiar with it, it's fairly equivalent. There's some semantic differences about what those functions do versus a normal function. It has to do with the keyword this, but for this example, it doesn't matter. So essentially, you can think of it as the same as just saying function, parentheses, curly brackets. And just like before, we're finding something in the DOM and then putting that component that I just created into the DOM at that place. The one big difference here is that now that I've created this component, I can also use it in my JSX, right? So I can reference this component that I created to create a new component. All right, so before I get deeper into code examples, I want to talk about some conceptual things that are, I think, pretty important to understand before you really dive into React. So the things are up there: functional programming, sort of like rules for accessing the DOM or not accessing the DOM, and finally, composable components. So I'm just going to go into these one by one. I really like this graphic, so I used it. But I don't necessarily agree with what they're asserting here, that like functional programming is the next evolution in programming beyond object-oriented. I think there's room for both. At least I haven't like fully jumped into functional for everything. But I think some of the concepts are really nice and makes your code a little bit easier to understand. So one of the main tenets of functional programming is this idea of pure functions, which we'll see a lot of when we talk about state in React. We'll get to that in a minute. So the main things behind pure functions are that you should not modify the input that you're given, and you should not have any side effects because of that function. So I'm going to show you some examples of what this means, but try to keep that in mind as we talk about React today, right? You should try to make your functions not modify any other state. And the benefit of doing that is that function is now reusable, right? If I have a function that doesn't modify my input and doesn't change any other state, then I could take that function and pass it anywhere, and it's always going to do the same thing, because it's only dependent on the inputs, and then the output should be the same every single time. All right, so here's an example of something that's not a pure function. If you take a look at this code, I'm getting an array, I'm looping through that array, and I'm changing each value by doubling the values, right? So this code actually modifies our input. And I'm returning the array here, but I don't actually need to return the array because this thing has already been modified, right? So if you have a reference to that thing, it's going to be different. And the one sort of key indicator that you can think about if you're trying to decide if a function is pure or not pure is if I call that function with that same variable multiple times, do I get the same thing back? So if I call this function with that array 5 times, I'm not going to get the same thing all 5 times, right? I'm going to change the array each time, which will then cause different results. So that's why this is not a pure function, right? Inputs are being modified, not pure. So this is an example of that same function, but in a pure form. So rather than modifying the array that we were given, we make a new array, we loop through that data that was passed in, and we modify, or we don't modify, we add the result of doubling that value to our new array. So now when I run this function, I can run it 1,000,000 times. If I give it the same array, I'm always going to get the same output, right? And I'm not affecting anything outside of that function. So this is an example of a pure function, and we'll see when we get to set state why that's important. Okay, one more example, because I think this comes up a lot in React especially, is an example where we're passing an object rather than an array. So in this one, we've got an object that's got an ID, and it's got, well, anyway, this object, and the function is going to add a name to that object. So I'm just going to give this object a key name and pass in that value for the name, right? When I call this, this is not pure because I'm modifying the object that I was given. So the way to get around that, or one way to get around that, is using object.assign. How many people are familiar with that? Okay, fewer. Or maybe you're just tired of answering my questions, I don't know. But in this example, object.assign essentially handles that problem by creating a new object. So what object.assign does is it merges values from right to left. In this example, the rightmost object has a key name and a value, which is this name that we're passing in. And then the second object is whatever object we're passing in. So this one is going to get merged into that one, which means that ID and name will now both be in this second merge object. And then those two that have gotten merged will be merged into this empty object. So that's a mouthful. I don't know if I explained that super well, but essentially we're just sort of combining from right to left into this empty object that we want to return, right? So the result's going to be a new object with 2 keys. One of the keys is going to be ID. It's going to be 53 as the value. And the other key is going to be name. And the value for that name is going to be Tim. So let me see what I want to say about that. So this is something that you'll see a ton in React code. And that's because when you do something called setting state in React, you want to modify part of the object, but not all of it. And I'll show you an example later of what I mean. How many people understood what I'm talking about here? Okay, good, good. I have this thing when I teach called a fist of 5, which is like put 5 fingers up if you really understood it and put 1 finger up if you don't know what I'm talking about. And I really want to be able to use that right now, but it's sort of inappropriate, I think, in a non-class setting. All right, cool. The next thing that I want to talk about is don't touch the DOM. So in React and in Angular as well, you shouldn't really be directly modifying the DOM very much. If you're coming from like a jQuery world or maybe just plain JavaScript, this will be kind of a weird thing for you, and your first sort of your first instinct will be to like just get something in the DOM and make a change when you have a problem that you're not sure about. But that's definitely not a good idea in React. This is just an example of like something you shouldn't do, because you shouldn't like put jQuery in your code base and find some p tag and then append to it, right? So in React, there's this concept of the virtual DOM. You can think of it as essentially just a copy of the DOM that you're modifying. And it's a really nice thing to have as long as you don't go messing around with the actual DOM. So the reason you want to always use set state and always use React's way of changing the DOM is because the React can do some nice things for you when it decides how frequently to render. So React can batch your rendering and essentially do it in the most efficient way it knows how. So DOM manipulation is an expensive operation, and React can realize like, hey, I'm changing the DOM here, and then 10 milliseconds later, I'm changing the DOM again. Maybe I can wait for those DOM changes, right? I'm not an expert on how it decides to do this, but the key takeaway here is you need to let React manage the DOM for you. You just need to write code that allows React to do its thing. So don't try to like circumvent it by interacting with it on your own. Okay, and the last sort of key concept here is this component-based architecture. So I alluded to it before, but here's a really good example. If you want to kind of read up more on it, there's a link down here. I'll make it a little bigger. It's Facebook's Thinking in React. So if you just Google Thinking in React, you'll probably come up with it. Oops. Essentially, the idea is how to break down a problem into components. So in this blog post, they talk about this app. It's essentially a shopping app where there's different categories of products, and each category has some products in it. So these outlines are different components that you want inside of your app. I think there's a component for the search bar, another component for the list of all the products. Within there, you've got items that are like actual items that you want to purchase, and then other items that are not things to purchase, but titles of categories, right? And the thing to take away from here is that, does anyone know the sort of rule of thumb when you're talking about object-oriented programming, which is prefer composition over inheritance? It's kind of the same idea with React here, right? When I first came to React, I liked it a lot because it sort of appealed to my object-oriented sense of things, which is rather than inherit from a bunch of junk, I'm just saying, okay, I want to make a list of stuff. And in order to make a list of stuff, I'm going to make a bunch of items and then use those items in like an array, right? So here, this is my list of stuff, this products component. And then I've got a bunch of these items inside of it. So this category item or this product item. That's in contrast to like making some sort of item class that's abstract and then inheriting from it as a category or inheriting from it as a product, right? You'd prefer to just use them inside of this bigger class rather than create some inheritance chain. Okay, cool. So now that I've gone through some of the conceptuals, the rest of this is just going to be kind of showing code and talking about how React does its thing. So in this example, I'm showing you what the class syntax looks like for React. So this is where React is going to. If you used create class in the past, like I was saying, that's going to kind of go away. What they're pushing people towards is this. One thing, or a reason that I really like it, I should say, is that JavaScript as a language, I mean, this is a JavaScript language feature, right? They're not making a whole bunch of new abstractions that are kind of brand new and different. You're just using JavaScript classes. This is just an ES 2015 class that inherits from a React component, right? But so yeah, I guess my point there is like you're using JavaScript language standards, and as the browsers catch up and more support these, we'll need the tooling less and less, right? Which I'll get into in a second. So in this example, it's again essentially the same thing we had before. We're returning a div and an h1 inside of this render method. Every component that we create has that render method. The only difference now is that rather than using the create class, we just make this class app that extends component. And if people aren't familiar with this syntax, it's really similar to the require. So you can actually use either one in React, but I think the docs and most people now prefer this import syntax, which essentially is just like require React and then React.React, or require React, React.component, right? Similar idea. Oh, excuse me. Okay, so how do you get all this stuff working? The sort of underlying answer to how does all this work is Webpack, and as part of Webpack, Babel. So Webpack is a build tool and bundler that has a lot of nice features. One of them is the ability to split code up. So if you have a view that renders frequently, maybe like your first app load, right, or the home screen of your app, you don't have to give the entire bundle to your browser. You can split it up into chunks and only have the browser download the thing that you need, which is a really cool feature. It's really nice to have. There's some other ones as well, right? So you can have a loader that does stuff like Sass to CSS, that transpiles your JSX into JavaScript. There's plugins as well for doing like Uglify and things like that. All the things that you expect from like Grunt or Gulp, you can do in Webpack, and you can do some more things. But if you're brand new to React, I would strongly encourage you to avoid Webpack. I'm gonna stand up on a soapbox here for a minute, but a lot of the sort of instruction behind React, I think before they get into anything, they talk about Webpack, and I think it's really detrimental because it's a complicated tool. There's a lot going on. I know I have tons and tons of bugs when I start dealing with Webpack. And they've made it a little better in Webpack too because they have some automatic validation of the config file. But there's a way to write React apps without having to deal with Webpack as you get started, and that is create React app. There's a bunch of other NPM modules that do similar things. But if you're new to React and you just want to get up and running, I would strongly encourage you to just use this NPM module called Create React App that sets everything up for you in a very like sane and usable default way. So all you have to do to get started is npm install-g create React App, create React App, the name of your app, and then cd into it, npm start, and you're ready to go. So this downloads all the modules that you need. This creates a Webpack config that's pretty good. And if you ever get to the point where you're like, I've got some really custom thing that I want to do that this isn't supporting, you can do npm eject, I believe, or npm run inject inside of there. And it'll essentially, all the config files that it has inside of this npm module will be ejected from the module and put into your code base so that you can modify whatever you need. So I would say there's really not a huge downside to using this, and it's a really great way to get started. So I'd suggest doing this over trying to understand Webpack before you've even written a line of React. This is just an example of what it gives you when you use the module. So you get all these files on the right, or sorry, on the left, your left, yeah. All the files on the left, and this is what it shows you. You can start writing some code in app.js. This is a test file, you get your CSS here. And then index.js is going to be where you get the entry point to your app. So it decides like what element you want to attach your component to. Okay, so I've managed to talk for, I don't know what, for like half an hour, and I still haven't really talked about some of the fundamentals of React and kind of the things that you use all the time, which are states and props. So I'll talk about that a little bit more now and show some code. So one of the really important concepts here in React is that props are something that never change. So what I mean by that is you can think of a prop as like an attribute of a component that is never going to change until that component gets removed and recreated. So a prop might be, let's go back here. So in this example, we've got this component, which is an item in our list, which is a product. A prop for that component might be the title of the product and the price of the product, right? Those are both things that were likely props. And you might ask yourself, like, well, if I create a component with props and I give it a title and I give it a price, what happens if I delete that component? Or what happens if I have some app that I can change the price for, right? How does that all work? So that's where state comes in. And we'll talk about that. So get back to it. Oh, okay. So here's my example of using props in the code before I get into state. In this example, I'm giving this component some text. And then when I actually use that component, I'm passing it in as an attribute to the, you can think of it as like the HTML tag, right? I'm saying, I want that text to be props example. So when I put this in the DOM, this.props.text is going to refer to this string that I passed in. So if you go back here, this.props.text will have that string. And one other thing that I didn't mention yet is that these curly braces mean I'm executing JavaScript inside of here. So you could put any arbitrary JavaScript you want inside of the curly braces, right? I could say this.props.text to uppercase, and it would turn whatever text I pass in to all uppercase, for example. Or you could have some really complicated code that does, a lot of things. But essentially, this is just saying convert this JavaScript code into some string that I can then put into the DOM. And in this example, again, I'm just passing in this attribute to my JSX, which says that's what I want my props to be. Okay, now to get into state. So the key things about state are that the state is the data that you want to change in your app. And you saw in that previous example that, go back here one more time. I said that these things are probably props, right? Well, those things could also be state somewhere else. And that's kind of the key thing with React. State should always be managed in one component, one place in your app. And a prop can be from some state. So what I mean by that is this outer component here, if you can see my mouse moving around, this green component might be the thing that has the state for all of those list items that we're showing here. And as the state of that array changes, I will re-render what's inside and give it new props. And React is smart enough to know how to, delete things that haven't changed or remove things from the DOM that need to be removed based on some diffing. And I'll talk about kind of how that works in a bit. But the key takeaway here is that we can have state in a higher level component that gets passed down to lower level components as props. And kind of see that in a sec. Anything else? State should only be managed. Yeah. So again, it's really important to understand here. There's nothing that's strictly enforcing this, but when you use React, you should always, always, always try to keep your state in one component. You shouldn't be like having state in one place that can also be modified in another component. That's a big no-no and causes a lot of sort of confusing bugs. So the idea behind keeping state in one place is that when there's an issue with that state, you know exactly where to go to, right? If there's an issue in this app where, like, I don't know, some category is not showing up correctly, I would immediately go to this outer component and see if like that data is right in that state. And if it's right, then there's probably something wrong with these inner components. If it's wrong, well, then I need to figure out like why that data is wrong that I'm getting. But there's really only like a couple options there of where the bug is, right? Which is different from traditional apps where you could have some function somewhere that you've never even heard of doing something to the state that's, you know, who knows where in your code base. But with React, it's one place where state's managed, and you can go there immediately to figure it out. Okay, cool. So what I want to show now is a little bit of code that I whipped up. It is literally the worst UI ever. So please don't judge me. Let's see here. Okay, that's running. Let's see if I can get this going. Yep. There it is. So I use create React app to throw together this really ugly looking to-do app. But I think it's really illustrative of kind of how React does its thing. So hopefully it'll be educational. Okay, so there's two main components to this app. Technically, you could even make it 3 components, right? But I was just lazy and made it 2. So I made one component for this whole outer thing, which is my whole to-do app, and then another component here for each to-do item. And I'm reusing that to-do item again and again for every item in my list. So let's see how that's working. You can see over here in my source, I've got to-do app and to-do item. First of all, to get that to render inside of index.js, I'm saying use this to-do app, right? So I'm importing that to-do app from my to-do app file over here and saying render that to-do app. So then over here in to-do app, we need to take a look at the render code and see what it does. All right. I'm not sure if people can see that. Okay, yeah, you've got a different view than me. So this is pretty simple HTML, right? I've got a div, form. So that form is these 2 things up here, the title and the description. And then below that, I've got another div, which is my list of to-dos. There's a unordered list, and inside of there, I'm going to put some LIs. Now, one thing that's kind of a gotcha with React is that right now you have to return one HTML element for your component. So right here, I have to wrap this in a div or some element, because if I don't, it'll give me an error because I've got like a list of tags that are next to each other, right? They're siblings in the tree. They're not one component that wraps them all. So just be aware of that when you're creating your React code. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about this form real quick. So another important thing here is kind of like how you do regular DOM things, right? If I can't mess with the DOM, how am I gonna keep track of what's changing on the screen? So the first thing that's really common is to modify something in the form. And normally when you're just writing jQuery or something else, you don't think much of doing this, right? You just created a input that you can type in. But with React, it's rendering everything, right? Every little change to the DOM gets rendered. So I actually have to write some code just to get that typing functionality to work, which is a little confusing at first, but it becomes really easy when you get to the time where you want to actually submit that title and description. Also, I'll show you what it's doing. So here inside of my input tag, I have to write this value here, which references my this.state.title. And if you go up here, I added this constructor function. How many people have seen these constructors in a class before? Okay, handful. This is just like, let me write this out real quick. Function to do app blah, this dot state equals some stuff, right? It's just like making OOP classes in JavaScript from before, except rather than make this constructor function, you just literally say constructor inside of your class now with ES 2015. So pretty similar, but you know, takes some getting used to. So inside this constructor, I'm saying these are all the properties that my state is going to have. It's going to have a title, a description, some array of to-dos, and then because I'm not getting this data from the internet, it doesn't have IDs, so I'm making this like fake ID thing that I'm going to keep track of. You can just kind of ignore that. But the main things that are important are the title, which is like what I'm typing in here, the description, what I'm typing in here, and then a list, which I'm displaying right here. Okay, so then kind of go through the flow of what's going on. Every time I type a key, this onChange event gets fired. So right here, if I type like H, what's actually happening to make this work is that an onChange event fires, which then invokes this handle change function. I've got this handle change up here, which calls set state, and it says this, let me change this code real quick to make it simpler. So, title is going to be target. All right, perfect. So what's happening is every time this onChange is getting clicked, I am calling set state and setting the title in this state to be whatever the value is of that input. So whatever is currently inside of this input will become the value for that state. Whenever you call set state, at some point that will trigger a re-render. So I'm changing this title value here in my state, which will trigger a re-render, and ultimately the key that I just typed will show up. Right? Now, I had some different code here before, and the reason I had this event.target.name will be kind of clear when I show you what's happening over here. So if I type over here, oh, interesting, yeah. When I type over here, nothing's happening in this input box. And the reason for that is the onChange function for description is the same function. So the way I was getting that to work before was rather than calling set state here, on the title, I was using an ES 2015 feature, which you'll see a lot in React as well, which was to interpret the key that you want for this object. So I'm not literally saying the key should be event.target.name here. I'm saying the key should be whatever this evaluates to. And this is just coming from the property of that HTML element. So if I go down here, event.property.name is title. So that's what will get put here as the key. Or in this example, event.target.name is description. So that will be the key. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question. I actually hid a little bit of complexity from you, but you astutely noticed it, so well done. Yes, it will be referring to the event. So that's not typically what you want. And the way to get around that is to do this really ugly, disgusting thing that I don't like too much, but it's really common nowadays, which is to say this dot handles, or for the handle change, this dot handle change equals this dot handle change dot bind this. So you're just saying, like, in my handle change function, I always want this to refer to my React component rather than something else, right? So you're not using the normal sort of way of interpreting what this means. You're just using the component always. And you'll end up doing this in your constructor for a lot of callback functions. You're just going to bind this to, or the function that you have to this. Yeah, it's a good question. I wanted to gloss over that because it's kind of a confusing point, but yeah, that's what this is doing. All right. So that gets me my changing there, but it doesn't really tell you how we do the submitting. So that's the next piece. So I've got this on submit, this dot handle submit here, and that's going to do the actual appending to the DOM, essentially. So the way that works is that we don't actually do any of the appending ourselves. Again, we just call set state. And the really important thing here, which I was mentioning with pure functions, is when you call set state, you don't want to modify the state itself. You only want to give it a new state that gets merged in. So in this example, it's kind of verbose, but hopefully it illustrates what's going on here. So I'm getting the title and the description from whatever the state currently is, right? And this is always up to date with every key press. So this will essentially be what we're submitting. So the title and the description are what we currently want to submit to our or add to the DOM. And then I'm making this new to do, which is just an object that I want to add to this array, right? So I've already got one kind of default in here, which is to walk my cat, because she likes to walk around my apartment, or my apartment complex, I should say. And I'm adding this new to-do item, which is going to have an ID, it's going to have a title, and it's going to have a description, which is whatever's currently in those two input boxes. And now here's sort of the like pure function stuff coming in. Rather than just saying this dot state dot to-dos dot push, which I can totally do, right? Like this is just a JavaScript array, it's nothing special. I can absolutely push to that array, but I don't want to do that because that would not be a pure function, that would modify my state, which could cause problems with React. So the way you get around that is that you use something like slice, which creates a copy of that array, and then I push a new to-do item to that new array. Right? There's other ways to do this which are a little cleaner, but I think this kind of illustrates the point a little better. So this creates a brand new array, which is a complete copy of that state, right? And then I'm putting a new thing in that array. I'm not modifying this original array, right? So that's a key point. Never, never, never modify the state inside of your anything that changes the state. Only create a copy and modify that new copy. So then inside of this set state call, we've got this new to-dos array that we want to set. We are going to increment the count by 1. And I also want to set the title and the description to nothing, which essentially clears out my input boxes, right? Because before I had some text in them, but now after I hit submit, I want them to be empty. So when I do all this, hopefully, right, I get that appended to the DOM. So when this set state gets called, at some point in the future, that DOM is going to get updated, and I'm going to get this thing down here. So the last thing to kind of tie all this together is how does that thing actually show up? How does this new thing automatically get added when I append to that array? And the way that's working is this little bit of code before my return in the render. So this is another sort of functional concept, you could say, where I'm mapping over my array of to-dos. So I'm saying this dot state dot to-dos dot map. Is everyone familiar with map? Yeah, okay, some. The idea behind map is essentially you take in some input and you return some output, and the original input is not modified. So I'm looping over this array of something, and I'm returning a new array of something, and this original data is not changed, right? So it's very similar to like a function in math, right? If you have like a function like x squared, you give it 5, you get out 25, right? That sounds right. And same thing here. I'm just giving it some data for the to-do, and I'm getting back some JSX, right? And then I do that for every to-do item, and I get back an array of to-dos. And I'm going to call that a list. You know, this is just a variable that contains my array. I can just call it like array of new to-dos, whatever I want. And then down here, I'm telling JSX to use that array of new to-dos. There we go. To use that array of new to-dos inside of that unordered list. So this array will essentially get put into my JSX for whatever I get back from this map. And render is called every time, not necessarily every time, but you can think of it as conceptually every time set state's called, render is called, right? So since I called set state up here, my state got changed. I will be looping over this array of to-dos again. I'll be creating a new array, and then down here, I'll have 2 to-do items rather than 1 to-do item. Yeah. Yeah, so the problem there is that it's sort of an artifact of how React gets performance for you, like is performant or more performant, I should say. Set state is not really synchronous, and that's by design. So when I call set state here, it's not like immediately doing a re-render. It could wait a little bit before it does the re-render. So if you change state and then you call set state, well, sorry, I should say if you like modify the state in here, then call set state, there's a chance that it can get into a weird configuration where like the state it's transitioning from is different than what you expect, right? So that's the reason you don't want to do it. Yeah. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so I would say that like typically the biggest performance bottleneck is not copying memory because like most of this stuff is just a couple of different keys, right? You're not keeping like images or anything, like you're not keeping data for images in there. Maybe like an array that, or a URL that points to an image. Typically the thing that's actually causing problems with performance in React is a concept called windowing, where like if I get 1,000 things back from the server and then I just blindly like put it in an array like this, I'll create 1,000 DOM elements and the user may never even see those, right? So you might have to be a little smarter about like how many things you actually create inside of this unordered list, for example. But I haven't seen a lot of performance problems with just the fact that you're copying, right? That's kind of like a basic tenet of functional programming is that like copying data doesn't really matter. So, you know, you can disagree with that. And in some cases, I'm sure it could actually matter. But I think the thing that's going to be the bigger bottleneck is the DOM rather than the copies of the memory. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
Good question about
yeah. Well, so what's going on is that I am setting, it's sort of 2 reasons for it. Well, it's because I'm doing this, I'm saying the value of that input is equal to whatever the state is, that if I don't have this on change, so like, let's say I remove this, right? Because I say the value is equal to this state, and there's nothing that's updating that state, it'll never change. If I didn't have that, oops, what did I do? Okay. If I didn't have this, then I'd also have the problem, right? Because I'd be typing something in, but then state wouldn't be changing, or the input wouldn't reflect that new state change, right? Because I'm not saying like what the state should be. So you can get rid of both of these things as well, and just have React like not care about that input. So if you don't necessarily need React to know what's going on there, you could just not have an on change or not have a value. But then React, like, doesn't know about that data. Yeah, so now that I've taken both, I could just type, yeah, and it works. But now when I like submit it, right, it doesn't have any data for it. Because it doesn't, like the state hasn't changed when I call set state because it doesn't know there was a change. Yeah, so that's kind of a strange concept at first, but it's really nice once you get used to it because then like you don't have to do finding stuff in the DOM and like getting the value inside the input, whatever it's currently at, right? It's just whatever your state is right now is what you're submitting. You don't have to, it's sort of like more work up front and less work at the end.
You have something in the title now and have something in the description. Will it copy over and your title?
Yeah, no, it's not. Right, because again, the title is not getting set by the state anymore, so there's nothing clearing it.
Oh, it doesn't. Oh, right.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good questions. Cool. There's one more thing I want to show, which is this to-do item here. So this is the to-do item component that I created also that we're using. Super simple. I'm just taking in two props, right? The title and the description. So you can see this is what the component looks like, and this is how we used it. So title, description. And this is kind of that key point that I was talking about earlier. These are pieces of state, right? But inside of the component, the to-do item component, they become props. So again, the state is only managed in one place, and that one place is the to-do app. And then that state gets passed into the child components as props. So all of these children are not changeable unless those to-do items are taken out of the DOM and new ones are created. But in here, all of that data is state, which can be changed. So it leads to other issues where it's like, if this item wants to actually make a change, it can't call set state. It has to be given a callback function, which it calls to notify the parent component to do the update, which is a little bit more advanced. But I've got an example of all this in an app on GitHub. So I'll show that at the end as well, if you want to grab that link, and I'll put it in the meetup as well. Okay, and one last thing, and then I'll call it. What was that one last thing? Feel like Steve Jobs, where he says one more thing, and then I forgot. Description, input. Oh, yeah, that was it. Okay, cool. So I talked earlier a little bit about how React figures out like how to update the DOM. And it needs a little bit of help from us in order to figure that out. So the way we do that is we give, anytime you have like a list of things in React, you need to give it a key. So you notice here, this to-do item has a key property that I'm passing in, which I'm not actually using inside of here. So the key property just uniquely identifies that, that component. And the reason that's important is that when React goes to figure out, like, let's say I deleted a to-do item from my list. When React goes to figure out what thing to remove, or what things need to be removed, it looks at these keys. So if you have some code that just like blindly always makes the key 5, right? It'll get really confused when it's trying to figure out what it should remove and what it shouldn't remove. So here, oops, I'm using the ID of the to-do in order to uniquely identify that component. And then when I delete something, it'll know that like, hey, I'm deleting to-do ID number 20, so everything else is cool. It doesn't need to be removed. Only to-do 20 needs to be removed from the column. In this example, I kind of like faked having a unique ID by having this counter, so that's what this was for. But in a real example, you'd probably be getting these from a server or something, so you could have like stable IDs that you can use. So yeah, that's pretty much it. The key takeaway there is like, you need to give it a little bit of help, and you need this to be something that is always unique. So for example, this can't be just like the index into the array, right? Because if I modify this array, then that ID no longer uniquely describes each item. It could shift the position in the array, then it'll screw up all of the data. So this thing should be something that is unique about that data. Alrighty. So yeah, I think that's about it. I'm out of stuff to talk about. I'll kind of leave you with some parting things. So I just scratched the surface with React today. There's a lot more to kind of get used to and understand. One of the cool things that sort of makes me really excited about React is that once you understand it and learn how to use it, there's a lot of applications. So people are making like React for VR, React for native development. There's even like a React Native for the web, so that you could write native code that's also usable on websites, which is pretty cool. So anyway, there's lots and lots of applications once you learn it, but I would say start with the web and then move on to other things. A couple of things that you might want to look into from here are lifecycle events in React. So I didn't really talk about like how you get stuff from the server. You would do that in a lifecycle event like component did mount, which essentially like notifies you that this component is being added to the DOM or has been added to the DOM. Now you can go get some data and update the DOM. Another thing that you may want to look into is some other state management like Redux or MobX. Those are probably something you've heard before. I would say get really, really comfortable with what we talked about today and really understand how to use set state before you move on to those things. I see a lot of students that are like trying to learn Redux at the very start, and I think it's kind of a mistake because you could write really powerful and interesting apps without knowing how to do Redux or any of those other pieces. So just get really good with set state, really understand how it works. And then once you get to the point where your apps get really, really large and you'll run into some issues with React that way, then start looking into Redux. Another thing we hadn't talked about, which is also really important, is routing. So with any client-side framework, routing comes into play. React Router version 4 is kind of the standard nowadays. It has some really cool features and it's pretty easy to use, but it's like just out. So one of the other things that maybe isn't the best about React is that it's very bleeding edge. So like React Router v4 probably came out like, I don't know, 2 weeks ago or something, or a week, I don't even know. And it's like the new standard, right? Like a week ago. So, and it's even worse than React Native. React Native gets updated every month, and it used to be every 2 weeks. So if you have an app that you started 3 months ago, it's already ancient, right? So that's kind of like the trade-off with React. It moves really fast, but it's a really cool community, and there's a lot of cool things going on there. So anyway, that's it. If you want to get in touch with me or Steve, there's our contact info again. Tim at Rhythm School, Tim Garcia 0, and I don't know what Steve's email is, but that's Steve as well. So thank you all very much. Thanks for coming, and I guess we have this room for a little bit, so if you want to just chill and hang out and talk about stuff, feel free. And thank you again for Pandora. Yeah.
So I just just wanted to say this is the first time hosting this group. There's a bunch of my team here. I manage the web team at Pandora, and we use React. So we might like to partner some more for more future presentations. But glad you all could make it, and we look forward to doing it again.
Thank you all.